And I did a lot of talking yesterday, so my voice is a bit, but it's okay. All right, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm also Ekdahl. I'm head of environment and climate change at World Steel, and I'm very happy to start the second session of the Open Forum with you today. So the first thing, safety is very important to us at World Steel. So before we go on, let me just say that we're not expecting any alarm tests or anything today. So if we hear a fire alarm, we need to evacuate immediately. And the easiest way to do that is to go to your right, out through these doors, and then, out to the back of the hotel. And we meet just outside there on the round space. And if those exits are not available or they are blocked, then we go out this other way, and then you go behind here. It takes you to the reception area, and then out the front of the hotel. But again, we're not expecting anything. So, all right. I also want to remind everyone that we have interpretation between Chinese and English. So you have your headsets on the tables, and these are the other two channels. World Steel also adheres by the strictest antitrust guidelines. So just to remind you about that very quickly, I'm sure you're familiar with the general principles, but we're not allowed to talk about prices or markets in any way. If you have any concerns, raise them with any one of World Steel staff here, and we'll address it immediately. For those of you who were not here yesterday, we just would like to encourage you to download our app. In the app, you can find all the speaker details, you can do networking, you can see, of course, the schedule and get updates. And also importantly, around lunchtime today, we'll launch our satisfaction survey there. So if you'd like to give us your views of the event and ideas and suggestions for future events in terms of topics and stuff, we would appreciate that very much, but we'll let you know when that survey is live. All right, I think that's all for me. The coffee breaks and lunch will be just outside the room, exactly like yesterday, so nothing new there. And this morning we're starting on a new topic. It's been mentioned, I think, many times throughout the discussions yesterday, the importance of measurement standards and the tracking of the emissions through the steel value chain. So I'm happy to introduce to you my colleague Claire Broadbent, who's head of sustainability, who will moderate this session.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Very nice to see you all here. Nice, bright and early after yesterday's very pleasant evening. So today, we're going to be talking about tracking the emissions. This comes up quite often. It has done over the previous open forums that we have, that we've held, and also some of the discussions we already had yesterday. And a lot of the time, it refers to green steel, what we prefer to call low carbon emission steel. And having some definitions for what actually does this mean. Whose role is it to set these definitions for low carbon emission steel? It's not my role, it's not World Steel's role currently. We're not in the position where we're going to be defining what green steel or low carbon emission steel is. But we are very happy to engage with all of you out there who are currently trying to define or have defined your versions of low carbon emission steel. Whether it's people like the IEA, GSCC, Responsible Steel, Klöckner, Eurofer, the European Commission, there's many different people out there who have defined this. But what is really key and what is very important is the way that these emissions are actually calculated for each of these different initiatives or different definitions. Ideally, they would all be aligned, they would all be comparable, they'd all be using the same methodology, the same data sets and will be very consistent. And we've heard a bit about this already. But there's even more people who are interested in defining methodologies, in talking about methodologies and deciding which methodologies they should be used. And here we often show this slide. It does change over time. We do keep adding different logos onto the slide. And also, it's not comprehensive. It's not got everybody on there. So if you are missing and you want to be on there, please come and make your case. But these are all people who are interested in this topic, many of whom are working on methodologies. You'll be pleased to know I'm not going to talk about all of them, or very many of them, or any of them at all, but it's growing. So even in the past week, we've received further documents that we need to comment on. One from the IEA, which is looking at definitions for near and low emission steel and cement and underlying emission measurement methods. Luckily, that one's only 10 pages. We had another one from the OECD. This one was 102 pages on towards more accurate, timely and granular product level carbon intensity metrics. So I get very excited by these reports just by the title of them, and disappointed that I don't have the time to go through in detail, because they are actually very good reports. We're not complaining about what's in them, it's just the sheer volume. And we also heard yesterday from the Climate Club about an event they're holding in a couple of weeks, emissions intensity definitions and standards for near zero steel and cement. So it's great that we're very popular, and it's great that we're kept very busy within World Steel. But the other good news is that within World Steel, we've been working on this for 3 decades, tracking emissions. Hopefully there's not very many of you who are younger than 30 in the room. It's always a bit depressing that we've been doing this for so long, and there's people being born in the meantime. Ian, who's at the back there, was here when we did actually start the measurement methodologies within the ISO standard for our LCA work. So we do have a lot of experience in this. We're not perfect either, so there's work for us to do. But last year's IEA report for the G7 was published and did actually recommend World Steel as one of the sort of sources of methodologies that should be used in conjunction with others to try to come up with some harmonisation, some alignment on emissions reporting. So there's also plenty of other people who are also interested in aligning. So just because everyone's making their own methodologies, they all want to align, but they all want to align their own way. So around the similar time to the IEA report being published, there were a number of organisations who sort of ended up sort of getting together into quite a small group to develop some principles on aligning on methodologies. So the 6 organisations, including World Steel, we developed a set of principles, partly recognising that there are needs to having different methodologies and different approaches, because some people want to report on company level or on site level or installation level, product level, different processes, whether it's for procurement, for finance, for policy. We heard about CBAM yesterday, which refers to products, but the methodology used for that is not a product methodology, it's based on the EU ETS. So there's a lot of diversity in terms of the understanding of what each of these different systems means. So everyone has their own raison d'etre, their own reason to exist, and we just want to try and get some harmonisation, some clearer understanding for all those of you who are not involved in methodologies to help understand what's out there. So the 6 organisations came up with the draft by COP, and then it was published, the principles that we had developed. But when it was published in COP and then following, we've got more than 40 different organisations who have signed up to the principles. So here you can see on the left-hand side another set of logos, many of which were on the first slide, hopefully. Well, most of them, some of the steel companies, not specifically, but these were the current set of organisations, whether they're steel companies, standards setting bodies, associations, global organisations, who have signed up to say, look, yes, we're all keen to align on methodologies. It's very keen that we have transparency, we have sort of clarity in what needs to be reported. But each of these different organisations has a very different role in terms of how they can help to align on methodologies. As World Steel, it's very clear that we ourselves, even though we have been working on this for 30 years, that things have changed. There are many more people involved, and there are changes that we need to make to our own methodologies. So we're making progress, and we talked a bit about this in the last Open Forums, but also since the launch of these principles at COP. We're leading a mapping exercise of more than 40 different methodologies and approaches to how CO2 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions are being accounted for within the steel sector. And we need to make sure that each of them is fit for purpose and then they're aligned as possible. But in order to be able to know how the whole landscape looks, we really need to have a detailed overview of each of the methodology approaches that are being undertaken. And then once we've done this, we can see what percentage of aspects of the methodologies are aligned and where the main work needs to be carried out. But there are also new topics that are coming up all the time. So we've heard about the new methods of making steel, the new technologies. This also needs to be included in the different methodologies, hydrogen, for example, but also how you account for CCU, CCS, and implementing these within the methodologies. And what's really important for us is to say, well, let's not let all of these different 40 organisations go and develop their own method, but let's just try, if someone's already started, let's try and work together on one single methodology for the steel sector and make sure that this can be implemented as widely as possible. So I encourage any of you in the room who are developing methods and approaches, I think through this group, through the Steel Standards Principles, it's a great way to connect and to make sure all the relevant people are involved. And if you're also wanting to sign these standards, then you are all very welcome to come and contact any one of us who have been involved. They're hosted very well on the WTO website, and they've been very key in helping promote these as well through their members. And just before we move on to the panel session and the discussions there, one other key aspect that was briefly touched on yesterday is linked to how the steel emissions, or the emissions from steel companies, of these either low carbon steel products or green steel products are being sold through the specific steel companies. This was referred to yesterday. Sometimes it's been referred to as mass balance, chain of custody. It's all about ways in which steel companies can today already show the reductions that they have within their steel products. I've just shown a few of the examples here. It's not in an exhaustive list, but it's just to give you an idea. Some of you will have heard of these different product offerings from the companies. So it's just so you know what is being referred to when we're talking about mass balance. And it's also to see if there is a willingness to pay from customers who are willing to purchase low-carbon steel products when the breakthrough technologies haven't yet been implemented to make the big reductions that are needed. So we have, again, a different set of principles. We heard yesterday from Hiro, who told us about the Japanese principles, and we've been working on these, but to try and transfer them into a global set of principles. And we published these on our website in April. So please feel free, go and have a look and have a read. They're just 2 pages long. Again, these should be the basis for what we're wanting other people to be looking at in terms of these different green steel offerings. And we're working now in more detail on the guidelines for how these can be really implemented, hopefully then leading to transparency, better understanding by external stakeholders. So then that's sort of, we know really from the steel industry perspective what we want, where we're going, the huge amount of work that needs to be done. But we thought it'd be interesting today to hear then from people outside of the steel industry itself, but still within the steel ecosystem. So we've got, I think, 4 great panelists today, and I'd like to invite them up onto the stage. So we have Ho from WTO, who's going to give us a trade perspective. Caroline from Steelwatch, who's giving a perspective from civil society. Elizabeth from Cargill Metals, from a trader perspective, and then finally Andrew from the Climate Group, who's then representing the customer perspective. So I'd like to invite the four of you up onto the stage, and then each one will give an introduction. Please come. And in terms of who they are, what they're doing, they can introduce themselves a lot better and what they're... and why this topic is important for them and why they're here today. So first of all, Ho, I'll ask you to... You can either come here, yeah. All right, so here's Ho from WTO.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much, Claire. It's great for us to be here. I think you already heard from Jean-Marie Pogam, our Deputy Director General, yesterday. I'm the Director for Trade and Environment at WTO. And yeah, just a few thoughts, actually, I mean, just before getting into the actual panel discussion. Firstly, as you all know, WTO is not a steel organization. WTO is not a standards body. And WTO is not an industry organization. So you might ask the question, why are we actually here? You know, and why so many of us are actually here? And I think part of the answer is that no matter what you're trading, whether you're trading steel or any other product, what is critical is that we need coherent, interoperable standards, and we need data. I mean, that's true for virtually everything in a supply chain. And it becomes particularly true when we look at the challenges that we face today with trade and climate. So it's really at this intersection that we find this topic so relevant and so important. And as you all know, WTO is the international organization with global rules for trade between nations. And when we think about supply chains and we think about trade, of course, a heavily traded commodity is steel. I don't need to tell that to you. You know that well. You know the statistics far better than I do. So that's on the trade side. Then, of course, that also matters for the climate side, because if we're going to make serious headway with reducing emissions, we need to look at decarbonization overall in the economy, and of course, a critical part of that decarbonization story is steel itself. So, and today at WTO, that relationship between trade and climate, if I could say, is one of the main, if not the main, one of the top 2 or 3 issues that the organization is really at the intersection of. So how do we relate more concretely to the topics that you're dealing with? I think Claire and all the other speakers have already been speaking about this. We could look at a whole range of trade policy issues related to steel, but rather we're looking at one particular set, a very important set that I started off with, really regulations and standards. And so when you come to WTO, the key agreement, as most of you know, is the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement. And that is the agreement that is at the WTO to promote harmonization and convergence of national regulations with international standards. As I was reading this last evening, I was thinking to myself, if that's the purpose of the TBT agreement, the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement, to promote harmonization and convergence, that agreement is then unfortunately very badly named. It shouldn't be the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement. It should really be the Technical Bridge for Trade Agreement, because I think that's what we're looking at. We're trying to build bridges, bridges between different countries, bridges between your different methodologies, differences between your different standards. And I think we have a great opportunity here to really strengthen these bridges and to really think through what is really needed for trade, for climate, for the industry. And here, again, why trade? Because we believe, and I don't think it's just us, we're seeing that the issue of trade is very high today on the climate agenda. It is very much a tool in the fight against climate change, and is also a tool to green value chains. But to make this tool effective, we do need greater transparency, we need greater coherence, we need interoperability, the bridges that I spoke about, between standards, regulations, and other trade-related climate measures. If we can do that, or if you can do that, I should say, because we're not in the business of trade as such, then we could do the three things that we know will be needed to move the needle on climate, which is we need to scale up, we need to reduce costs, and we need to disseminate widely low carbon solutions and technologies. So that in a very broad sense is why we think it's so important to be here. On the more negative side, of course, what we would want to avoid is increased trade frictions, increased trade disputes, and fragmentation globally. So there's the opportunity, but there's also the risks and there's also the threat. And if we go down the line of fragmentation, which unfortunately is around us, we think that will be a major impediment both for trade and for climate. And so in a sense, the work that you're doing here today is so vital to take this forward. I know I've spoken quite a bit, not meant to give such a long introduction, but I think I'd like to move quite quickly to some of the things happening at WTO today. I think Claire already mentioned the steel standards principles that we were happily to be involved in, working with World Steel and all the other organizations, some of you, many of you who are in the room today. And we hope that work can be carried forward. I think you have opportunities to do so. Some of you may be participating in COP29 in Baku in Azerbaijan towards the end of the year. At the WTO, my Director General met with the President of Azerbaijan just last week, and we've had very strong signals that they will be having a trade and investment day at Baku. We think that would be, again, a very good opportunity to come back with steel standards principles and possibly more organizations endorsing and thinking about the next steps that can be taken on steel standards principles. If we can do that, I think you would be providing a very strong signal to the possibility to build bridges, which is what I started with these few comments. And I think it's a critical moment to build these bridges because going beyond standards and regulations, you do see a lot of challenges on trade-related climate measures. And we do see a large diversity of trade-related measures being taken. And that potential for fragmentation is very high. But then on the good news, at the WTO, we've had two very important submissions from the United States and from China to the Committee on Trade and Environment, as well as to the Committee on Technical Barriers to Trade, advocating for more discussions on interoperability of trade-related climate measures. It's not specific to steel, it's a horizontal discussion, but we think it's a discussion that potentially could be a game changer in how we look at these issues at the WTO. And so we would also like to take back what we learned from you over the next two days or so. That could be really important to these discussions. So let me stop there, Claire, and then thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Ho. I'd ask that we save questions, write them down so you don't forget them, and we'll take all the questions after the four speakers. So, Caroline, I'd like to invite you to come up.
Thanks very much, Claire. I'm Caroline Ashley from Steelwatch. You've heard me say that, but perhaps you haven't. You might not be familiar with what Steelwatch is and why we exist. So I should perhaps say a little about that, because I've had people coming up saying in the coffee break, oh, are you a research organisation? And the reason we exist is very much explaining our lens on measurement and methodologies. First, I will just say we are a civil society voice. I definitely wouldn't claim that we speak as the civil society voice. There are many, so I speak for Steelwatch. Why do we exist? And what are the assumptions? We are an international non-profit organisation, and we are a climate campaign organisation. So we're registered in Europe, but we work internationally. We are non-profit, and by climate campaign, I mean we are fundamentally a climate organisation that is solely focused on the steel sector, and that makes us quite unusual, if not unique. And we're a campaign organisation in that we think our job is to create pressure for faster and deeper decarbonisation. So we're not a measurement or methodology organisation, as you will tell from my comments on the measurement topic. Our focus is driving change. The assumptions we bring are that change is going to be massive and probably deeper than many of us are thinking about, whether it's for good or for bad. It may well be for bad. The change that climate change will bring will be so dramatic that the upheaval of the years of Trump and Brexit and right-wing movements and floods that we've had so far are going to pale into comparison, and COVID too. So we think there will be real change in society and the economy. We have insurance companies saying they won't have a business model at 3 degrees of climate change, which is what we are on track for at the minute. Or there will be really fundamental change in creating a new net zero economy where everyone can thrive. And thrive is shorthand for many complicated issues around a just transition, which I won't go into today. But either way, the change is really big. So our job is to encourage the steel sector to decarbonise faster and more fundamentally, so we get to the good future, the future we envision that is decarbonised and thriving, rather than the bad future where steel is still emitting over 3 billion tonnes of CO2 in 2040 and eating up the carbon budget, which I think would be a disaster, as I commented yesterday. So what does that have to do with measurement? It means the lens we bring is what drives change. And a good measurement system for me is one that encourages faster and deeper change. And a bad one is one that doesn't do that or blocks it. So the first point is that measurement methodologies on their own are not going to drive change. We don't think that's enough. And as I said, that's why we campaign. We put direct pressure on companies. We have 2 specific campaigns at the minute, but we also want to encourage the whole industry to move. So what do we then need from measurement? Why is it important? Firstly, the old adage, you manage what you measure. If you don't measure it, you don't manage it. If you don't know what human rights abuses are happening in your value chain, you're probably not going to do anything about them. We all know that, and the same goes for climate, for carbon emissions. You have to know them to manage them, and I'm sure that's one reason that companies have started paying much more attention to measuring them. The second reason is the fundamental principle of accountability. We think corporates are accountable for their impacts, their good impacts and their bad ones. And you cannot be accountable if you don't know what those are, and we cannot hold companies accountable if we don't know what those impacts are, which comes to the fact that we, civil society, and here I will speak for civil society in general, civil society, free press, media, government regulators all need information to hold companies accountable. And it might not be nice, personally, to be held accountable, but we all depend on a world where players are held accountable. This hotel has had to comply with regulations and prove it, and we are glad that they do. So we all benefit from the fundamental principle of accountability. Third reason it's important is perhaps the one that's most relevant today. The shift that is happening in the sector is driven by many different market mechanisms, and they can only work effectively if measurement and reporting and disclosure are working effectively. So we've already heard from the trade point of view how important good measurement is to enable trade to help drive decarbonisation in steel. But it's not just trade. We will hear about demand. If automakers want clean steel, they need to know what that looks like. If civil society wants to put on pressure, we need to know where emissions are too high or too low or rising or falling. There are many, many different levers of change in this market system. Investors are coming in, beginning to focus on decarbonisation in steel. They need the information too. So that's fundamentally why we need much better measurement and disclosure. There's a couple of things that I just want to comment on where it's not good enough now, and also where we see change needed as change happens in the future. Where is this going? So where it's not good enough now is disclosure and comparability. This lovely term, interoperability, I think is a key one. I'll just talk about comparability. I don't know if anyone in the room can tell me how all those, say the top 100 or top 20 steel producing companies compare in terms of their carbon emissions. If you've got that sorted for your methodology, please come and speak to myself and Roman in the tea break, because it's flipping difficult to make those comparisons. the data is all over the place. Different ways of reporting, different metrics, different boundaries, and so on. If you can tell me which company has the best, fastest decarbonisation pathway or decarbonisation targets, then I'm probably buying you dinner and some gin and tonics. It is very difficult to assess. Carbon intensity here, volume of emissions there, excluding joint ventures here. Read it off a graph on that page. Read it from page 177 in the annex on that one. It is, this is 2030, this is 2050. I mean, it is a mess. So we need comparability. Secondly, we need disclosure. As I said, civil society, we can only do our job if the information is out there. Maybe there's information you report to the World Steel Association that we don't have. Maybe there's information you supply to those you supply steel to, or investors we don't have. Looking at what is in the public domain, it is a mess. Now, maybe I'm telling you you're doing a great job at hiding the information if that's what your bosses want you to do. I don't think that's necessarily what's going on. I think it's the emergence of maturity in the sector. That this has popped up in many different places. People have done it for CDP, they've done it for this. There's not a standard way of doing it yet. But there does need to be more commonality and comparability in what is put in the public domain. Please. We will start challenging companies because I think it's part of good corporate responsibility is to do decent disclosure. So that will become one of our asks of a good, responsible steel company. That's what we need right now. We need comparability and we need more disclosure. But I want to just mention one thing looking forward that I think is incredibly important and will need more attention. And that's around Scope 3. Scope 3 emissions are already important and receiving insufficient attention because we all know that the methane from coal mining is critical and is often ignored. I think we have someone from EMBA in the room, and EMBA have put out very good data saying the climate impact of the steel industry is 27% higher due to the methane emissions that are so often ignored. You can debate the methodology there, of course we will, but the point is that coal mining methane emissions tend to be neglected, so we underweight the impact of coal-based steel production, which we believe has to go, just in case that wasn't clear. There are more reasons why Scope 3 is going to get important. Joint ventures, according to the GHG protocol, sit in Scope 3. I don't want to argue with the GHG protocol about their methodology. I've got enough battles within the steel sector. But let's just say that joint ventures are going to be more important. The ArcelorMittal Nippon Steel joint venture in India is one of the fastest growing coal-burning investments in the planet at the minute. And if that's a joint venture, we can see that's a way of the future. As steel making in India and Southeast Asia grows, which is what is predicted, we can expect more of it to be in joint ventures. There's no way that can be neglected in climate reporting. Another reason Scope 3 is important is we heard yesterday about disintermediation of the value chain or relocation or fracturing of the value chain. We think this is part of this huge transformation. It's a good thing if the integrated steel plant is no longer the core model of the future, but a company is perhaps buying its clean sponge iron, its green HBI from somewhere else. We expect more DRI, that maybe it's gas, maybe it's hydrogen, more renewable electricity. We expect different models of the steel company, but all of those will need to be accounted. What's the emissions of your gas? What's the emissions of your hydrogen? What's the emissions of your clean DRI? What's the emissions of all the different things you are bringing in to where the steel making is? Scope 3 will become more important as more elements of what is currently in the integrated steelmaking plant move outside the boundary. And the final reason why Scope 3 is important is actual, real data, not just on climate, but on the many different impacts of what's happening out there, whether it's nature, biodiversity, people, or climate. In this industry, there's too much assumption of, oh, there's an assumed factor over there, we'll use that. In the food sector, where I've also worked, there's much more knowledge of what is really happening down the supply chain. We know that's going to be increased focused in Europe, and I think should be everywhere. And steel companies are going to need more real data on their Scope 3 emissions for that reason as well. So that's my push for the future, please, as you work on methodologies. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Caroline. And now we'll invite, I believe the right order is Lisbeth, to give a view from Cargill Metals.
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Claire, for the introduction. So I am Lisbeth from Cargill Metals, and I can imagine that many of you think, who is Cargill Metals? So I will say, from Cargill Metals, I will give you a more practical angle on this topic. But first, let me say who is Cargill, and more specifically, who is Cargill Metals. Oh, and now I have to use the pointer, I think. The green button. Okay, there we go. Cargill Metals. Cargill, for those that might know, Cargill is a big American commodity house trading company. More working, or for 95% working on the agricultural and food space. So we produce and trade all products and raw materials in the food space. We are, as said, an American company, 160,000 employees working across 70 countries. And as you can see on the page, working on the agricultural supply chain, on proteins and salts, on animal nutrition, food and bio, etc. And at the very right, I think, of your side, you see their financial services and metals. And it's that team that I am part of. So at Cargill Metals, what do we do? Again, trading company, as Claire also introduced. We trade iron ore and steel. We have no assets. So what do? We buy on an annual basis about 50 million tons of iron ore, on an annual basis about 4 to 5 million tons of steel. How do we do that? As a trader, we have some added services. We provide commodity risk management services, sometimes market access, technical support, capital solutions, etc. And it's where we can bring a value that we're in the supply chain. Now, as working on the supply chain, as you can imagine, we work a lot with iron ore producers, we speak to steel producers, we speak to steel service centers. And it's from that angle, from that experience, that I would want to comment on this topic, which also is very close to my heart. So why is tracking emissions down the value chain so important? I totally echo what Ashley also said. You cannot act upon decarbonization if you don't know the numbers. So if we want to achieve decarbonization, knowing the numbers is essential, it is key. And to this, I want to bring two examples of recent conversations that we have been having with end customers and steel service centers. A first example is actually in 2-3 companies, eco-design people. They, as you know, they map their products. They want to know what their emissions are and also the upstream scope of steel. And what they have to conclude is, while they would love to show, well, I have a 7% reduction in my Scope 3 emissions or a 24% reduction, they just can't because they do not have the numbers. And while there is more carbon footprints and EPDs coming on the market, it is the low product that have these informations. But the reference products actually do not have these informations. And as a consequence, if companies want to make their carbon footprint, they have to use global assumptions and then work with that. So it is for them impossible, actually, to track gradual emissions on an accurate basis. The second example that I want to give is actually a more sad one. It was an end customer coming to a steel service center. And the end customer comes in and says, well, I would like to buy some green steel. Okay, so they bring up the catalog. Okay, we have here option product ABC with a mass balance solution ABC. We have here a product on low emission with option A and B. And after looking at the catalog, the end customer got confused. It was too complex. And he said, well, never mind, we'll just go for the regular steel. That was quite unfortunate. While there was somebody really wanting to create that demand for green steel, because of the complexity, stepped away from it. Now, what do we as Cargill do? As I said, we're a trading company. We don't have our assets. What can we provide value for? We work on two items. The first is an obvious one, I think, is we encourage our partners to get their carbon footprints. We need more numbers, so we need to get them defined and also ideally externally verified. So that is a role that we play. The second that we're now working on, because we strongly believe that you have to indeed track the emissions throughout the value chain, is we are now developing a prototype digital product passport. We believe if you want to pass on emissions through the value chain, you have to make it digitally possible. You have to make it easy on the next person or company in the value chain to take the previous information and continue to work on it. We believe a digital traceability tool allows to do that. So we are now developing a prototype on iron ore and steel of flows that we import into Europe. Now, to conclude, it was the last question that Claire asked. What do we need? What should we be doing? Obviously, as I said before, we need more carbon footprints. If we want to get more intelligence, we need the numbers, not only of the low emission products, but also the reference products. But what is very important to that, and that was the introduction of Claire, we need a good footprint methodology. And what is good? And I'm just adding here some thoughts. Obviously, it has to be trustworthy. Makes all the sense in the world. It also has to be easy to understand. You can have a lot of numbers, all the products, but what I've heard in the market, which undoubtedly others of you have also heard, is I want something like when buying electrical appliances. I want to know, am I at a level A or a B or a C, a color coding, just so that I understand exactly what I'm buying. Also, very important, it should not be too complex. And here I might be a bit provocative, but I will nonetheless do that. I want to question a little bit the EPD. In the market, we hear a lot of ask for EPDs. And up to 2 months ago, I was totally into the game. I thought, yes, EPDs is what we need. But then I got a bit closer to what the pros, but also the cons are on the EPDs. So what is pro? Totally, it's academic, it's exhaustive. It does not only look at the carbon footprint, but all the environmental metrics. It is the ideal tool that we need. But when looking closer at it, at the practical side of it, I doubt if today our industry is ready to use this. Now, why do I say that? I don't think it is the fastest and most accurate tool or easy tool to understand to communicate emissions. First of all, it takes 6 to 8 months to produce the LCA. That's a long process. The good side of having all environmental impacts, the acidification, eutrophication, is really nice. But in the majority of cases, we only use that global warming potential. And what happens often is if you get an updated data point on your carbon footprint from your supplier, you cannot integrate it into your EPD because you don't have the other 9 metrics, and hence you keep working with global assumptions. And that's what why I would like to question that maybe something smaller scale methodology would help us move forward a bit quicker in the industry. Okay, that's the end. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Elizabeth. And finally, Andrew.
Good morning, everybody. As you can see, my name's Andrew Forth. I work for an organisation called the Climate Group. I'm going to talk to you about steel, but first I'd like to talk to you all about carrots. We heard a lot of talk about carrots yesterday, and I have a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old daughter, 7-year-old and 5-year-old daughters, so carrots are an increasingly large discussion topic in my house. I was looking into the history of carrots because my daughter really likes history, and there's actually quite a lot of similarities. You may recognise some of these trends. So they're first recorded as emerging in the Middle East. They became a core part of European and global life. Now, about half of global production is in China, and they're an essential tool for improving health and quality of life outcomes. There's a lot of similarities with steel, in case you hadn't picked up my subtle point there. So I'd like to talk to you today about the work that Climate Group are doing to plant some seeds so that we can all have more carrots. I'm going to do a quick introduction to who Climate Group are, and in particular the Steel Zero campaign that I work on. So we are an international NGO. We're based in London, but we have offices in New York, Amsterdam, New Delhi and Beijing. So wherever you are in the world, you can work with us pretty much. Our goal is net zero by 2050, and we do that by working with companies to drive climate action fast. We have partnerships with over 500 multinational businesses operating in 175 markets worldwide. We also work closely with subnational governments. We are the secretariat of something called the Under 2 Coalition, which includes around 170 subnational governments around the world, every continent, countries that I couldn't put where they are on a map. But fundamentally, they are subnational governments who want to drive climate action fast. I'm particular here today to talk to you about Steel Zero. So Steel Zero is an initiative where we work with companies who want to buy lower emission steel. The companies that sign up to be Steel Zero members range from everything from organisations like Maersk, who are buying container ships, right the way down to luxury watchmakers who are buying the tiniest pieces of steel that any of us can imagine. They commit to buying 50% of their steel by 2030 will be lower emission steel, and we're defining that now by either steel produced by a steelmaking site with a science-based target or lower emission steel aligned with the Responsible Steel Progress Level 2. That gets the standards talk out the way, because I think we've heard enough about standards. I want to talk a little bit about how we can make the next steps. My colleague Sarah, who's here, has spent the last year working with our members to try and figure out how much carbon is the steel that they are buying actually creating. We'll be publishing a bit of information about that later this year. To cut a long story short, it's a really hard process. The numbers we've got aren't strong enough for us to publish and say with confidence, these are the right outcomes. And these are the companies in the world who are most committed to decarbonising the steel they're buying. If these guys are having a problem, can you imagine how difficult it is for everyone else? So what are we doing to try and address that? Well, first of all, we're doing our best to help steel buyers work together to see what is being successful. How are they working with their supply chains? How are they engaging with their customers to try and drive this forward? We work with steelmakers. We don't have steelmakers as members, but we talk to them a lot to see what data is out there. How can we make it better? And most importantly, my job is how do we work with policymakers to create a level playing field? I think the key thing I'd like you to take away from this slide, you can read them all later, is that Steel Zero members want to be accountable. These are companies that want to stand up and say, the work we are doing is making a difference to global steel emissions. So this is, I guess, the crux of my argument. The data that's out there at the moment, and Lisbeth's comments about EPDs, I would echo that almost entirely. We don't know what's out there. EPDs don't always identify which site the product actually came from, what production route it came from, and they don't have consistent approaches. In other markets, we wouldn't accept that yet. In steel, we're asking people who are buying those products to accept it. That's not great. Which comes to, I'm actually going to slightly skip over this one. The fundamental point that the businesses we speak to, both Steel Zero members and people who aren't Steel Zero members, is that if they're going to buy green steel, low emission steel, low embodied carbon, whatever you want to call it, they need to have the confidence that they can claim that the steel they are buying is better for the environment than a standard steel product. There's threats of shareholder lawsuits, there's threats of greenwashing legislation in various markets, and at the moment, they can't do that. How can we address that fact? From my perspective, and this may not make me popular in this room, we need to have a conversation between steel makers and steel buyers. Steel buyers, some of them, increasing number, recognise that behaviour change is going to be really important. Customers recognise and are prepared to pay more for their steel if it is something that they can get a return on. But that's not going to happen unless they can make the claims. The steel industry needs to accept that emissions data is not commercially confidential. I'm sorry, but you can't say no one wants to buy green steel when you're asking people to buy a product that won't let them make a green claim. You wouldn't ask a car buyer to buy something where the emissions data was hidden. You wouldn't ask somebody to buy a food product and say, well, I'm not telling you where it's from, not telling you where it's grown. It's organic, trust me, I'm nice. Doesn't work like that. And at the moment, all I hear from steelmakers is emissions data is too complicated, it's commercially sensitive. What do you want to have, guys? Do you want to be able to sell steel in the future? Or do you want commercial confidentiality for a few more years so that the market doesn't develop? I think there's a better way forward. We know that your customers want to work with you to help get a better way forward. Come and start having a conversation with organisations like us, with Lisbeth, with Caroline, with anyone really, and tell us, okay, what data should steel buyers be asking for? What should regulators be setting as their requirements for definitions? What can help steel buyers track the steel that people are buying and using through a value chain? I was recently talking to a car manufacturer, and I dread to think how many countries and different steel products steel goes into that car. That's going to be one of the hardest things to measure, but that's also one of the industries which you guys like selling steel to the most because they pay you a lot of money for the steel they buy. You need to help them, else they're going to come under increasing pressure and they're going to look to other materials. And I guess the final one, moving back to carrots, because we all like carrots and we don't like sticks, is how can governments work with steel buyers and steel producers to make it easier for you guys to invest with confidence in low carbon solutions? This isn't going to be an easy process, we recognise that. Commercial confidentiality and business is deeply ingrained in a number of organisations within the steel sector, but we need to challenge that. I'd love to hear your views and questions. I'll be around later today. You've got hopefully about 45 minutes to ask me as many rude questions as you'd like. But what I'd like to take away from this is going back to carrots. What can we do together to make sure that everybody has access to carrots in the future, and that wherever you are in the world, whatever type of steel you want to buy, you can be confident that it's going to be there, because the transition to net zero, not just in the steel sector, but in the global economy, is going to require an awful lot of steel. So for those companies that make the step, there's a huge market waiting for you. For those companies that don't, well, the stick's out there. It's not going to be a pleasant experience for some of you. I'll leave it at that. Hopefully I don't get pelted with carrots as I walk off the stage. Thank you for your attention, and look forward to the questions.
All right, so the good news is that everyone thinks there's still going to be a need for steel, so that's already positive. The other thing is that I think we hear the concern about the detail of EPDs and the complexity in the LCA. And yes, we have been working on it a long time. There is, however, a place still, I think, personally, for this data in terms of having global average data sets, generic data that can be used, at least in the first stage. And there is a big call for having more specific data from upstream suppliers. So there's also the pressure then that's needed, not just from the steel sector, but on our raw material providers. I'm just looking around. I see someone had already been waving to ask a question. I'm happy to jump in with questions from the floor directly if there are some burning questions. So we have first one from Philippe, I think from someone online. Or not?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
So there's a question online, I think it's for Mr. Lin, but it's actually related to, I think, topics that were discussed before. So on trade protectionism measures, so for example, restricting the movement of scrap and other prime quality iron ore. So what are the thoughts of WTO about these measures being put in place and how it's restricting the decarbonization measures as well forward? It's a question from the Turkish Steel Producer Associations. Thank you.
Okay, you want to answer? It's.
Do you want to pick up more questions, or you want me to?
Well, this one's less focused on the methodologies, I think, but we can have a quick answer for this and then pick up some more.
Yeah, sure. It's a pretty broad question. I mean, so if you look at it in terms of trade protectionism, of course, that's what the whole of the WTO is about. I mean, all of the agreements of the WTO are designed to essentially deal with situations that could be said to be protectionist. And, you know, at the same time, I think we also have to recognize that, you know, governments do regulate and governments do have other objectives. And it's a question of how do they match both different public policy objectives as well, the reason why they might be protecting a particular sector and what the agreements actually allow. So it's a bit hard for me to answer, apart from to say that, of course, all of WTO is about addressing concerns of trade protectionism. Different avenues for doing so, different agreements, depends on the measures and depends on what actual measure we're speaking about. Is it a question of concern to WTO? Of course it is. And we do have increasing discussions about, I don't like to jump immediately into calling a measure protectionist or not, but let's say there are trade frictions, trade concerns. The question of whether something's protectionist or not tends to be a very legal question in the WTO, depending on how that measure is designed and implemented. But the short story is, yes, we would like to reduce situations where trade disputes arise, and we would like to do that before they become a dispute, essentially.
Okay, thanks. So we've heard from all of you, I think, in terms of what we can do better, do more of, be more transparent. Do you see other sectors who are doing a better job currently than the steel sector? What can we learn from your sort of perspectives? I know through the climate group you have Concrete Zero, and then you're also all working, you have different, you cover multiple materials through WTO and potentially through the other speakers. Are there areas that we can really learn from to save us reinventing the wheel or helping us move forward in a faster way in this topic? It's open to any of you who want to answer.
I'm happy to start off there. I think everyone likes to be told that they're unique. The reality is there's a lot of similarities between a lot of these different decarbonisation drives. I think one area where we have seen real progress along lines which could be of interest to the steel industry is the transition to renewables. We've seen commitments of advanced purchasing, of power purchase agreements. We've seen financial institutions specifically set up just looking at investment into renewables. And I think the key there has been clear transparency around, you know, what's being procured, how it's going to be operated, and importantly, government support for the production. So things like contracts for difference in the UK and now increasingly across Europe have given investors certainty. And I think having that clear agreed standards is really important. Yes, steel is a lot more complicated than sort of renewable electricity in that regard. But I think the combination of industry leadership, financial support, and government and regulatory support is something where a sort of coalition could be built that could drive similar levels of change.
Yeah, I think I mentioned the food industry, which I don't think is perfect, but I think has been working on this longer, and there are some interesting lessons, both good and bad. I mean, it's hard to chip a cocoa bean. The food industry is working with very, very small products. I mean, Cargill, this is your business. But there has been a lot of work on how to go right back down to the cocoa farmer and the local level and get real data. And if the food industry can do that, I think the steel industry can, because it's working with many fewer suppliers. Just the other point I'd make is about 5 years ago, regenerative agriculture started being talked about in food. And that's like, oh, that's way too ambitious. You know, we already can't do organic, and regenerative is about actually regenerating nature, not just being clean and even organic. It's seen as far too ambitious. Just this morning, I was listening to BBC UK radio, and the industry is talking about regenerative agriculture and standards. And in 5 years, something that was such a stupid, ambitious idea as these civil society organisations talk about, the industry is now talking about its own standards. So things really do change quickly. We've seen that in food. We've seen that in other sectors. Let's expect it in steel.
Yeah, maybe is it working? Yeah, cool. Okay, maybe just one thing that I also would like to add is, despite me not knowing exactly how it works in the shipping industry or in the biogas industry or in the power sector, what I do know is that they are very fluent in mass balancing and certificates, etc. And I think you can only get to that next level if you have the foundation right. So I think also looking into the shipping, the energy sector could also be potentially interesting.
All right, thanks a lot. Helene, you had a question. Apparently speak and then introduce yourself. No, it's not.
Yeah, now? Yeah. Helene Axelsson, Swedish Steel Industry. Actually, a question both to Lisbeth and Andrew. Lisbeth, you said, well, EPDs are not perfect, they're too complicated, we need something more simple. What did you mean? Do you mean, well, it's enough with a carbon footprint, or do you mean something else? And for Andrew, you, on the other hand, said that EPDs are not enough. And said that, well, we need to know the site, the production route, etc. And I guess that would be things that the companies are more reluctant to show. So why do you need that? If we have, I know EPDs are not perfect either, because they're not always comparable. But in the perfect world, will we actually have a good standard for how to measure, and we actually get figures where there is full environmental impact or where there is a carbon footprint, which is comparable? Why would you need to know the site, etc.?
I go first? Yeah. So it's about the reservations that I have on the EPD. Yeah? So the challenges or the questions that I have is the length and the accuracy. So what I could think of, but I will not claim that I have the answer here, but I wonder if limiting to a product carbon footprint would already be helpful, for the two reasons that you can do it a bit quicker, and you do not do the other 90% of the LCA that you would not use anyway, so you save on time, and it would allow you more easily to take in supplier-specific data and hence get to an accurate or a more accurate footprint. So I would investigate if potentially a product carbon footprint, which does include the scope 3 as well, could be an alternative for communicating for the next 5 years or so, until we get all the EPD assumptions better organized.
On the specific question about EPD, so I was reading through an EPD the other day, and it was for a metal flooring product. And it said that this product is made from steel that's either made in the United Arab Emirates, the UK, or the Netherlands, and it's produced either in an electric arc furnace or in a blast furnace. What use is that to somebody who wants to know what emissions level the steel they're buying is? So I'm not picking on the company involved, you can probably guess who it is, but that is not helpful. It's a lot of money spent on something that's taken a number of months, cost probably $10,000, $15,000 US to produce a nice certificate. What is a better option? Well, so at Steel Zero, we're partners with Responsible Steel. A number of steel makers in here have Responsible Steel certified sites. I think let's see how we can work together. I think having responsible steel, certified steel being produced so that you have the sort of full range of data in a sort of broadly standard way would be really helpful. Annie, I'm sure, will be happy to talk to you all about that. But I think we need more precision in the data, and we need it in a way that is more reflective of the actual values that are associated with that steel.
Could I just comment? So the question is not really the data from the steelworks, because the ones who made that EPD probably might have had that from the different suppliers. And it could be perfectly okay, but they didn't turn it into their own EPD.
So this was a product made by a steelmaker.
Strange.
I think the point is that sometimes EPDs are made and it's an average of a company as opposed to a site-specific data, and then they don't have the transparency there. But I think one of the answers in terms of or feedback on the EPDs, yes, they are more complex, but what they do help to do is to avoid unintended consequences. So while we're transitioning maybe to using a lot more hydrogen, what actually is the impact of that, for example, on water? How much extra water is going to be needed, how much extra water is going to be produced, and a carbon footprint by itself won't do that. And an EPD or an LCA is something which is going to be able to cover that. So yes, it is more complex, but you can sort of see those consequences of the decisions we're making. Rutger, please.
Rutger Gyllenram, Cobalt Partners. I've been working with the European standardization and global standardization for EPDs for the last 15 years, I think. And that work has been really focused on avoiding greenwash and avoiding sub-optimization. And I really get the chill when I hear you saying that we need to do something fast and simpler, because you would end up in problems with sub-optimization and with greenwash. There is nothing that stops you from asking for site-specific or process-specific EPDs. It's quite possible, but it's not necessary for the companies to do, and therefore they make company-specific EPDs. So it's what the market asks for. The other thing I'd like to raise is that the companies today spend enormous amounts of time on developing these EPDs, gathering data, and in the end, the data sourcing is done by the operators, by the process engineers. That's also supposed to work with optimizing the processes, improving the performance of the company. And we cannot really put much more pressure on these people and still having the companies work in a reasonably good way, because you can't just add more people. It will not be more efficient. It will be Parkinson's law multiplied by 5. So instead, we need to improve the system we got. I fully acknowledge the problems you see, and I think the steel industry acknowledges what you are saying. But as I see it, we need to improve the way we produce EPDs, and we need to also acknowledge, make them faster, make them more accurate, make them more up-to-date. Fair enough. It's possible to do, but not adding new systems on top of this system that we already have and that is mandatory, because that will not help the environment, that will not help decarbonization. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Rutger. Any feedback or I think good points?
Very fair points. Yeah.
Okay, another question? Yep.
Hello, good morning. My name is Harsh. I'm the CEO of Centra World. We help steel companies measure and report their CO2 emissions. So I like the point around the distinction between a PCF and an EPD. Now, whenever you're doing either a CCF, a PCF, an LCA, or an EPD, there are two components. You calculate you calculate the answers, and then you get a third party to come and verify that. I think it's quick to do your own calculations and put it out there, but the whole process of getting a third party to come in and verify that is expensive. It is time consuming, and there's only a limited amount that a third party can come in and actually check. Is there an alternative that we as a group can accept as an alternative to having a third party come in and verify it? I think earlier Andrew talked about making a lot of this data public, right? What are the tools and technologies that we can actually use to skip that part about having a lot of third party verification actually happening?
Any comments?
I think that's a really interesting question. I want to sort of bring things back a little bit to what some of the steel buyers are telling us. So they are also facing increasing requests from regulators, from their customers, to be transparent about the data that they are providing on the emissions associated with their products. So this isn't companies asking for this for the, just for fun. They're asking for this because they need to satisfy their regulators and their customers. And what we will see if steel can't step up on this is material substitution in a lot of sectors. If you can't get accurate data on the steel flooring that you want to put in your building, the steel, the thing I was talking about earlier was sort of metal steel that goes in the structure, not on the actual surface. People will start using other materials because they can't get building permission, they can't comply with regulations. So this isn't a game. I'm not doing this for the hell of it. I'm doing this because I think steel's really important and we want people to be able to use it. But if we can't find a way to do this, the answer is going to be less steel, certainly in Europe. And I think we'll be surprised at which countries and companies are stepping up to the plate on this. I was speaking to one large steel buyer recently, and they said the best and most accurate data and the most trusted data they had came from the mills they worked with in China. They were confident in the data they got from there, far more than they were from the data that they got from their European, from their North American, from their Latin American. It's a company that operates in 170 countries. And they said one country they have faith in the data from.
Interesting. One of the other challenges we do have in terms of the data and the complexity is from the supply chain that we mentioned. And yes, we can have more pressure on the suppliers to provide their data, but in the meantime, we have to rely on generic data. But the problem is then we're all relying on different generic data. So we as World Steel, we're using a tool called Gabi, and the database in there is commercially available. And we would love that everybody is using the same upstream data, so at least that part becomes comparable when you're relying on the generic data. But obviously, there is a cost to that. There are other databases out there, but they also come with the cost. And what we would like to see is, this is a question for Ho, maybe in terms of because you're members of the governments, and if we're trying to find some open source data, we need to have more pressure on whoever it is that can help generate this data. And maybe the governments could play a role in terms of having some publicly available data, maybe on a national level if it's in terms of energy, but also for the upstream impacts of iron ore mining, coal mining, etc. And I don't know whether you see that there is a role here that the WTO could play in terms of putting pressure from that angle of providing data.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just a couple of very general thoughts on this discussion about EPDs, data, and so forth. One, and third-party verification. I mean, one thing I think might be important to bring into the picture is how easy is it for developing countries and for smaller scale producers to meet some of these requirements? And that's a balance, you know, better data, better quality, better requirements on the one hand, versus the inclusivity of these schemes. At WTO, we are not experts in coming up with emission measurement methodologies and so forth, but that's a very current topic in supply chains today, which is what's the right balance between being inclusive, between being efficient, between being ambitious. You know? So I think that's something for all of us to think about. Clearly, from a WTO trade perspective, we want supply chains to be inclusive. We don't want it to shut out certain producers or certain regions or certain developing countries. And potentially, we think that can actually make climate ambition even harder. The other point in terms of data and the role of WTO, I think one, again, is a very general question. It's a bit like to the industry, like, you know, and I think we see that today, whether the industry organizes itself and does its things on a voluntary basis to find the solutions, or whether you are asking government to come in to regulate, essentially, and to make it mandatory. And I think there's these two aspects going on. So I think your carrot and stick, if I can put it that way, is part of that equation. Now, if you're looking for the WTO angle, you know, potentially, we could be a place to help the data question, data problem, but we're not experts in this. So we have to be told more concretely what it is that you think the WTO can do, and what is the data that you're willing to share with the WTO. But then we can use our convening power or the role of a secretariat to try to provide this on a sort of a public good basis, if you like, you know. We can't really tell governments what to do. I mean, that's not really our role at the WTO, because WTO is made up of 164 governments. They come to WTO, actually the other way around, to tell us what they want to be done. And we have different committees and different forums for that discussion to happen, so we could be helpful in that way, as we were with steel standards principles, to convene a discussion, to bring a dialogue. If this is the critical issue for the industry, if it is about data, if you need to build that cooperation amongst yourselves and to get government actors into that discussion, that's something that we could help with. And then the more technical part of the repository, if you like, of data, I think that's something we will need to look at more carefully, but potentially, yes, you know, we could talk about that. You know.
Thanks. Yeah, you want to add something?
Very, very quickly. One thing which has been, I think, quite helpful is seeing governments adopt values relating to the emissions in things like public procurement legislation. So the US federal government and a number of states have the Buy Clean principles, which cover steel products, concrete, and I think some other things. Last month, the German Steel Association, I think with the sort of tacit support of the German government, produced the low emission steel standard. That, having those approaches, enables you to be transparent and set environmental priorities and requirements in contracts, in regulations. And I think having a method which is hopefully open and people can understand around the world will create sort of some degree of alignment, even if it is alignment in Germany or the US, and may then spread.
Great, thanks. Hans. Annie first, please.
Thanks. Thank you, Claire. Annie Heaton, Responsible Steel. I was very struck by your story, Elizabeth, about the customer who goes looking for green steel. What a sad state of affairs, given all the efforts that are going on in this arena. And I was also struck, Caroline, by your plea for accountability on the basis of comparable data. And I think back to the work that Responsible Steel started in 2019 to create that comparability through the development of the Principle 10 of our standard on greenhouse gases. And I think of the work that we've done, which asks steelmakers to report on a company basis, on a site level, and on a product level, so that the customer, the NGO, the government can have access to that data. Now, we have 7% of the world steel industry now having achieved our core level of certification. But not one steelmaker has yet got their product certified under our much more stringent certified steel requirements. Those certified steel requirements require a product carbon footprint, which may be in the form of an EPD. They also require a measurement of the emissions of the product in such a way that enables comparability across the world, no matter what country, no matter what product. So that enables then some comparison, some benchmarking to happen, which I think, Caroline, is perhaps what you're after, but I think it's also what the customer is after, as Andrew's alluded to. So in the certified steel, that is the data that you would be getting. You would also be having that updated every 18 months. And the standard itself could well be interoperable with some of the other examples you've been mentioning on the panel. There's a 5-year revision process. We're preparing to do that next year. We have a very transparent process. All of our developments of our standard are open to 2 public consultations. We follow the WTO's 6 principles of the technical barriers to trade. And we're a multi-stakeholder organization, so we're very, very much attuned to the interests of the steel industry and to the calls of civil society. And we try to balance the two. And the very purpose of Responsible Steel is to create a facility that actually helps drive the decarbonisation and the sustainability that I think we all want to see. So I'm going to take a bit of a gamble, and I would like to ask every member of the panel, if every steelmaker in this room were to certify their steel according to the requirements of Responsible Steel standard and show their progress levels in decarbonisation, and also, by the way, track their raw materials back to the mine, know where they came from, know what the risks are, and be working with those suppliers to produce good sustainability practices and good greenhouse gas data, what would be missing? Would that provide you with the transparent, comparable data that civil society and customers need?
All right, anyone ready to answer? Oh, I saw some other hands flying up, but we will try and take some, if we have, keep answers quick, because there's a couple of other questions, I think, in the room.
I think mine's quick, because I'll go for the easy answer, in that the actual details of what I would be able to access if they did that, I'm not like on top of, oh, I would need that, and I would have that, and I wouldn't have that. I'd be very happy if that was true, but I can just say the one yes, but, or the and item. We are interested in change, the direction of change and the speed of change. So for that, I need not just the product level and the site level. I need that to be complemented by the company level. I need all 3, because any 1 or 2 can lead to perverse or suboptimal, to use Rutger's work, analysis. And I need to know the direction and the targets and the implementation plan. And I need targets for intensity and targets for emissions and targets for every scope. So if they fully complied with Responsible Steel certification for today and set targets in equally comparable words, I would be really happy, and maybe soon I'd be out of a job because it would drive faster change.
Nothing to add. Yes, I think it would.
Can I just say, I think yes for 2 of the 3 types of companies that I think exist out there in the steel buying world. So we have around 50 members. Those are companies who are like, yep, we want to be a leader, we want to drive this forward. There's another chunk of companies who are, we want to help, but at the moment we're not ready to make that commitment because we have concerns around data. And then there's a third group of companies who want that certainty that the product is there and is definitely 100% what they think it is. I think at the moment we've got too many companies in the middle category who want to do good but aren't sending that signal to steelmakers that they are prepared to pay. I think, Annie, what you're suggesting would be a huge boost to our campaign to get that second group, that kind of big middle of companies, into the kind of market for buying a sort of premium, lower emission product.
All right, thanks. Okay, I saw 3 hands and we've got 4.5 minutes. So first of all, we have one on the left and then at the back.
Hello. Hi, I am Izan Choksi working for E3G and wanted to take the pressure off Caroline a little bit to be another CSO voice in the room. So yeah, I convene a network of over 160 CSO members called the European Fossil Free Steel Network. And I guess I just wanted to bring a concern that this conversation, the methodology conversation and the conversation around data and emissions data and how do we do it, and it's too complex and the data's simply not there. These are conversations that every industry has had to face when facing up to their climate responsibilities. And every industry spends the first 15 years saying, too complex, not there. And then eventually they get pressure from regulation, and eventually the pressure builds up with CSOs as well. And eventually they start doing it very quickly, in fact. And it turns out it's not that hard. And I do recognize that there are conversations that have been going on for a very long time, decades, around EPDs, and also around emissions data collection and how do we actually measure this. But those are mature conversations, and really we're at a stage of implementation. And I guess my plea is that we can really bring some urgency into this room, and some urgency around not just, you know, government regulators are coming and knocking on our door in the next couple of years, but really urgency around the climate, and we're running out of time. So I guess that's what our role as CSOs in this room is. So in that sense, I wanted to tell a story, which is the story of coal in financial institutions. And Urgewald, a small organization dedicated to kind of following the money and trying to find out who is funding coal organizations, coal companies and coal miners and so forth. They went to financial institutions and they said, okay, so you guys need to divest from coal. And the financial institutions turned around with a furrowed brow and they said, oh, well, we just don't know how much coal we're invested in, because a lot of these coal companies have lots of these names that don't actually show that they're coal companies at all. So Urgewald went away and with a team of 3 within a year, developed a way towards one financial institution that was based in Scandinavia to actually map exactly what coal companies they were investing in. They went back to this financial institution and say, you're not actually investing in just 15 million worth of coal, 50 million euros worth of coal. You're actually investing over 500 million euros in coal. And they showed them the list of these coal companies that they were actually investing in. The Scandinavian investment firm decided very quickly to develop a coal exclusion policy. That was back in 2017. Now, a huge number of financial institutions have those same coal exclusion policies based on the data that Urgewald gives them of what coal companies they're actually investing in. It's a small NGO, okay? What I'm saying is that NGOs cannot do the same things that companies do. We can't be the ones to tell you transparency is necessary and then provide that transparency for you. Companies need to really be able to do that themselves. I noticed that presentation from Cargill was from 2018. Is this a presentation that kind of gets trotted out for the last 6 years showing the same thing? Oh, the data's too complex. Oh, it's simply not there. Rather than actually putting the sort of the fire in the belly and saying, actually, okay, we can't just spend the next 6 years saying the same thing. In fact, we need a new presentation that says this is how we're implementing. Thanks.
All right, thanks. We'll take the question that was at the back, and then I think we're going to have to take the other questions over the coffee break.
Hi, I'm Gosia Kasprzak. I work at the United Nations Environment Programme. I just want to say thank you to Mrs. Ashley for bringing up Scope 3 emissions. I work at the International Methane Emissions Observatory, and I can confirm numbers that coal mine methane accounts for around a third of the climate footprint of steel, and so far this has been very much underappreciated. However, the satellites are getting much, much better at detecting the emissions and quantifying them, and we are witnessing a lightning speed development of the satellite processing capacities. So far, I've been hearing that the coal mine methane emissions have not been included because of the lack of a good data set to include such data into the steel climate footprint. If we happen to have satellite data faster than the companies reporting, do you think the companies are ready to accept the fact that the steel climate footprint is around 30% larger than it was before?
Okay, I think, yeah, this is going to be quite a big communications challenge but that's certainly not a reason not to include it. I must say that we do actually include methane emissions at least in the World Steel data, and I believe in many of the EPDs, maybe not the most accurate data that you're talking about, but in terms of what's currently publicly available. But I wonder if anyone on the panel wanted to respond.
I would just take the general point that satellite data is very much on the radar of civil society for methane and in other ways as well. And I think technology developments in general are going to get rid of some of these, oh, it's so difficult reasons. And Isan already flagged this, it's so difficult, will fall eventually. I do think satellite data and general technology is going to help, and civil society will be using it, and I flipping well hope companies do as well. Can I just add one more thing? There is a mindset issue here, which I think is what Isan raised, and Andrew is saying it's a competitive issue. And steel is a service to society, and ultimately the business model of steel will be selling a service to a bridge and to society in which climate footprint is as normal as financial regularity. And I think it's just fundamentally today's conversation isn't about methods, it's about mindset shift.
Yeah, and I must say though that as we're reporting an increased number from the emissions, our emissions haven't actually gone up. It's the reported number that will go up. And this is going to be the challenge in terms of how people like yourselves saying, oh, look, the steel industry, they've suddenly gone up by 30% in emissions. And it hasn't. It's the reported numbers gone up, and it's then how we sort of work together to not sort of shame the industry in terms of increasing the emissions because they're going up and not down, but just in terms of how they're going to be reported on.
May I answer that quickly, Claire? I know I want to be an intelligent challenger and challenge the direction of change and not challenge an industry or a company because the reported numbers have gone up, but what they're actually doing. And for example, Andrew talked about leaders. I would much rather a car supplier said, we're going to drive change, and actually we're not going to go for mass balance now, immediately to change it this year, but instead we're going to put our leadership into driving change that will only come through in 3 years from proper green HDRI. I want to be an intelligent challenger that will see the value of real change, not the fiddling the numbers. So, welcome these kind of advice to us as well.
Great. Yeah, I still see your hands, but I also see maybe you want to go for a coffee. No one? Anyone want to go for a coffee? No? All right. I'm afraid we're going to have to close this session. People who've got questions, you know who the panelists are, and feel free to run onto the stage or find people in the coffee break. Thanks, everyone, for your questions. Thanks very much to the panelists, and we see you back here in half an hour.